Hello, and welcome back to Book and Page. We are into Chapter 8 of All Quiet on the Western Front. So as always, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in this chapter, and then talk about things in a little more depth. So, Paul has just finished his leave and has been sent off to a training camp in the moors, where he practices drills and drumming, and spends his free time playing the piano. He knows the area, but not many of the people left. This is where he did his original basic training, but all of the people he knew are gone mostly. Beside the training camp, there is now a Russian prisoner of war camp, and much of the chapter is actually spent considering these prisoners, who Paul recognizes would have been big, burly men if they hadn't been starving, and they now look like kicked St. Bernards, if he were to describe them. The Russians actually spend much of their time scrounging for food, or for begging for food, which does anger some of the Germans enough to actually give them kicks, but other Germans take advantage of it because the Russians are willing to trade practically everything they own for some good food. Or better food than what they're getting, at least. Paul often is on guard duty around the camp, so he does spend a lot of time with the Russians. He communicates with them, and these times on guards give him a chance to think about the fact that the Russians are literal human beings that a command has made him think of as the enemy, and that that's not really fair. But this line of thought is actually dangerous for Paul, and he has to force himself not to think about it, because, like I said last chapter, he would go mad if he thought about these moral implications a little too much. The chapter actually finishes up when his father and sister come to visit the last Sunday he is at the training camp. They end up discussing the fact that his mother is ill. It is cancer. She's now in the hospital, but the problem is that they are poor and probably cannot afford the treatment that she needs. Yeah, real pick-me-up, huh? I'm sorry I ended with this book. But in the words of my professor, we'll end with something horrible, the dark dredges of humanity, and then we will take a break, and you'll be able to live life better, knowing you haven't experienced the worst of it. Yeah, my professor said it better than I did. This is a much shorter chapter in comparison to the several chapters we've had ahead of this and the next chapter coming up. Part of that, again, is the subject matter has to be broached, but thinking about it too much in depth can just sort of drive you mad. So it's actually a really good thing that Remarque has included the Russian prisoner of war camp. It fully sort of paints the picture that this is not him attempting to make the Germans come off as like the great wondrous people who did nothing wrong. It really is this recognition of the legitimate horrors of war in all of their forms. It is not just a one-sided history on that. Remarque is also looking at the not nice sections of history that a lot of us, truth be told, tend to shy away from. And Paul does shy away from it in ways that, again, for a soldier, like, immediately must be how he looks at things, or he will go mad, he won't be able to do what he's been ordered to do, and that's just going to get him killed. But it's important for us to sort of face up to these things and not just sit in a way that we sit there and say, look at these bad people for what they did. Like, we have to admit that this is a thing that we did in all countries involved in the war. The city I'm actually in has an old fort that never saw military action, except during World War I and World War II, where we actually were internment camps for Canadians of certain European descent. Like, yeah, like, legitimately, we were also a prisoner of war camp during World War II. We had German prisoners of war in my city. But that's not something historically you want to look at. It's much more tempting to tell yourself the nice history, but shying away from the not nice parts isn't something we should do. That's actually a disservice to ourselves and also to the people who were affected by those actions. But it's hard. I recognize that. It is hard to admit that you were in the wrong. And there is a disconnect between Paul and ourselves right now, because it is a question of Paul being a direct participant in World War I versus us historically, where, sure, maybe none of us have killed anybody or imprisoned them directly. It's, again, that issue with colonialism. But to stand there and deny it ever happened is the worst thing that you can do. The first step you have to make is accepting that historically you are not always in the right. That mistakes have been made and that you need to own up to them as a society and start trying to repair the damage. But the other disconnect, again, is also simply time. This stuff is happening in the immediacy for Paul, while for us there is distance there. Distance from actions, but also distance in response time, right? We've had time to process it. But forgetting it is not processing it. Recognizing what we did and how it was wrong and how people suffered because of it is a key point of learning from history. Because it is not actually the big, sweeping actions that are always that concern for repeating history. It is the micro actions. We might never hit the point where we have trench warfare like we did during World War I, but there are those small actions that we need to keep in mind. I went to visit Germany during high school. I've mentioned this. They will tell you when you go to war monuments that you can't goose step, that you can't do the Nazi salute, don't pretend you got a Hitler mustache, don't do anything like that. Because it is precisely that style of action that is that micro action against the issue. It is this response that in a lot of ways, in trying to deal with things that have had this great historic interaction, right? But it's the small things that you need to be careful about. And this is still something very important in today's life, right? It's those small thoughts about us versus them that eventually build to allow the big sweeping movements. We had internment camps for Canadians of German descent, Ukrainian descent, Polish descent, because we already had those small ways of thinking that allowed for that to happen. So we have to battle against those small ways of thinking. And it's interesting to actually see Paul at that moment in time fighting with himself against these small ways of thinking, where he's seeing just how similar the Russians and the Germans actually are. But what I find really interesting about this chapter is one of the mediums that actually crosses that country barrier in this moment. Despite Paul's insistence that he can't think about the Russians being humans that he's been ordered to treat as enemies, there's actually a section that comes after this where there is a Russian man playing his violin. And this is a really powerful moment because of the build-up from the chapter. First, we've already been told that the Russians have traded everything of value away to get more food, except there is one man here who has kept his violin. Because it turns out there are things that you were willing to fight to keep, even at your own destruction. And that's, again, a microcosm of the war as a whole. But what's interesting is that what's being fought for in this moment is the ability to play music. It is this one musician's wish to keep his violin and to play it. But he's not keeping that for himself, or even for just the Russians in the camp. He hears that Paul plays the piano, and he immediately gets excited. He's connected with this enemy through music at a critical time, where at this moment one side has all of the power. The Russians aren't on the front fighting back. They are defeated. They are broken men, but they still have this ability to connect and want to share music. And it's this quiet moment where they have buried one of their own, but have connected to one of the enemy. And they just sit there and let the music wash over them. And some of the Russians join in singing, but they also stop and just listen to the violin. Because music is one of those things that precisely helps us remember our humanity. The ability to take an instrument and play something that has no material value. No material value can be assigned to this here. He doesn't come to Paul afterwards with his hand out, asking for some food for the song or some cigarettes or anything like this. It is purely this moment of enjoying art as a human creation that all of us can share. And it's a touching moment because music, from what we've seen in this chapter, has been something that Paul is trying to keep in his life. From the previous chapter, he couldn't sit and read. He couldn't talk with his own family easily. But he comes to the training camp and he can play the piano. And he can listen to this Russian man play the violin. Music is something that he's kept in his life, and he's tried to keep in other people's lives as well. If you remember back to the chapter where Kemmeridge is dying, one of the things that Paul tells him is that when he goes to the hospital, he will be able to play the piano. Music is this quiet moment in absolute desolation where everybody can come together. But it is a moment. It is precisely a moment. No musical score lasts forever. And then everybody has to return back to the suffering and take on new suffering as well. Because Paul's father and sister comes and he learns about his mother being too ill and not being able to afford treatment. And it is one of those moments again where you think, with everything he is sacrificing for his country, this is precisely the moment where we've had a connection with the enemy, this musical connection with the Russian prisoners, and Paul has to face the fact that his own country will not help his family because they can't afford it. You'd think they should hear that this woman has a soldier son at war and say, everything is handled. But that's not how it works. Going to war is not going to solve the poverty problem in his family. Just like listening to the Russian violinist is not going to solve the war itself. And it's these moments that are really the struggling points that you have to let go. Because if you hold on too tightly about feeling a connection with Russian prisoners and being abandoned by your own country, how then do you go back to the front and continue on? Paul convinces himself. In the very last section of this chapter, he's eating a cake that his family has given him, and he has no interest in eating it, so he thinks, I'll take it all to the Russians. And then his head says, no, you can't do that, because his mother made this while in pain. He has to continue existing in this us versus them mentality, even when he makes connections with the enemy. Because what are you fighting for with all of this suffering? You have to give yourself an answer, even if it's an answer that you're not going to like the next day, 2 years later, 10 years later, generations later. You need to give yourself an answer. Yet Paul still connects with the Russians. He doesn't bring them all the cakes, but he does bring them two. He is recognizing that these are human beings that he's been told to hate. Even if that's unfair. And even if he has to accept that just to continue surviving. I hate to say it, but this book has no easy answers for us. There is no one single philosophy or moral understanding that is going to allow us to understand all sides of this war. Because there are justifications on all sides, there are horrors on all sides, and there are atrocities committed on all sides. And that's not going to be an easy thing for us to accept, because to accept it, we have to admit the guilt of our own side as well. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.